we might get started, and then as more people arrive, we can let them in. So welcome everybody to our third webinar in our series, in which we have invited some of the contributors from the edited volume #Hustle to discuss with us their amazing work and to begin to extend the conversations going on across different fields about influencer labor and how we can think about the kind of cultural, economic, social, and legal impact of influencers working within the creator economy. It's so lovely to be able to do this as well in dialogue with two invited respondents today, whose work also resonates with that of Lucia and Claire's. And so we're really looking forward to diving into this a bit more deeply. How we're going to structure the session is we will begin with two presentations shortly from Lucia and Claire, who will introduce their chapters, and then our two lovely respondents, Tom and Archer, will offer some thoughts and provocations before we use whatever time we have left to engage in a discussion all together. And to kind of, I guess, set the scene a little bit before we get underway, the ambition of the book is to really think about how we grapple and understand what's going on in terms of labor practices, working conditions, the legal qualification of labor within the influence industry. And this builds on kind of the work that has been going on for a while within kind of humanities, social sciences, creator studies, and looking at the kind of range of practices and activities that creators are enacting as they professionalize, as they engage in monetization and assemble these kind of portfolios of business models and emerge as these economic actors within the platform economy. And to bring this into dialogue with what has been going on within law and policy, and really building on the first volume that Catalina Goanta co-edited with Sofia Ranchados, The Regulation of Social Media Influencers. And so in this book, we bring together 11 chapters from scholars from a range of different disciplines to begin to think through some of the kind of theoretical underpinnings of influencer labor, some of the empirical strategies and practices that influencers have developed as they are working within the industry, and then thinking through the legal implications of this influencer labor and the kind of question of who is protected, how are they protected, how do we think about the position or the relationships between influencers and platforms in terms of the labor that's enacted are things that are threaded throughout the chapters and including the ones that we're going to discuss today. So before we do that, I know that Isabel and Catalina are also on the call and two of the editors of this volume. So I thought I would see whether you would like to say a few words as well before we get underway.
Isabel, would you like to start?
Maybe you start, because I have a lot of noise in the background. I'm in the train.
Okay, absolutely. Very nice to see you, everyone. Thank you so very much, first of all, to the authors. It's been really a pleasure to interact with your work and to feature it in the book. Many thanks also to our very kind discussants. I very much look forward to our debate today. We already had a webinar earlier today where we saw the tensions, the kind of tensions that we really wanted to cover in this volume, because on the one hand, you know, from a legal perspective, we look at labor and we think, well, there are some very specific conditions that are set up in the law, and there are very specific traditions of labor that the law will see and that the law is going to account for. But at the same time, we notice that in the influencer economy, there are so many cultural practices of monetization that not only can be invisible to the law, but also raise the question of, do they really fit the kind of rules that we're working with? And in our multidisciplinary explorations, also together with Taylor, and also a very, very different collaborations that we've had in the past with Tom as well, looking at different child influencers on TikTok, earlier work that we've done with Isabel, also for the first volume, looking at contracts of influencers, we noticed that literature is very, very siloed. So there are going to be audiences for the very different practices and the very different disciplinary angles. And we really wanted to break those silos and put together a volume that speaks to everyone who is interested in this field, bringing together different perspectives that definitely enrich, on the one hand, the media studies angle of labor by bringing the cultural entrepreneurship dimension, but also the legal implications. And on the other hand, the legal perspective, looking at the practices and the types of monetization that can occur on in the influencer economy. So with this being said, we really very much thank you once more for engaging with this volume. We're very happy that it is available on the internet in open access, and I very much look forward to the discussions. And maybe one last thing to say, Isabel, as a professor of labor law, I think perhaps in the discussions that are going to unfold here today, even if you're in the train, maybe in the chat, we can just share some comments, particularly on Claire's presentation. So thank you very, very much, and I look forward to everything that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. So we will now begin our two presentations. The first one comes from Lucia Bainotti, who is an assistant professor in digital and visual media analysis at the Department of Media Studies in the University of Amsterdam here in the Netherlands. And she will introduce to us her chapter, The Composite Careers of Social Media Content Creators, Labor, Precarity, and Identity. So I'll hand it over to you, Lucia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Taylor. Let me just share my screen and hopefully you see my slides now. Yes, wonderful. Yeah, thank you again for having me here today. And most importantly, thank you for inviting me, for contributing to this edited volume. I was very pleased, and I would like to thank again you guys who put together this amazing work and how you curated everything with extreme kindness and professionality. So really, thank you for your work as well. What I'm going to do today is introduce the idea of the composite career of content creators. And I'm going to look at it from the perspective of labor and identity, and from the disciplines from which I come from. So mostly digital sociology and media studies. So a little bit of context of where this research come from and how it started. These are two news articles that oriented my research when I first started to approach influencer culture back in 2020, 2019. And the discourses that were surrounding around influencers and being an influencers were basically folded. On the one hand, there was this idea that everyone wanted to be an influencer, that influencer marketing was indeed the future, and that the influencer was the new aspired career for lots of kids, that instead of being actors or actresses, would have liked to become influencers instead. And on the other hand, there were also like a sort of tension there, and we can discuss whether still holds or not, right? But in the early 2020s, it was really a thing to ask ourselves, but is it being a social media influencer really a career? Like, can you do that as a living? And some of the piece of news that was found over those years were actually, in a way, putting a negative light on influencers who are basically dedicating their lives to create content for social media platforms and spend, time photographing themselves doing silly things. And so this sort of dichotomy really got me thinking about how labor is conceived when we talk about content creators, and what does this mean when the profession that you make, so the job that you do, is so closely entwined with free labor and the dimension of fun and the dimension of aesthetics. So throughout my chapter, I want to investigate how content creators conceive and construct their careers, and in turn, how this influences their identities and their self-perceptions. And to do that, I rely on two sets of concepts. The first one is my more media studies kind of soul, and their relation and the idea of platform and platformization. When we study content creators and their activities online, we cannot but take into account how their practices are influenced by the penetration of digital platforms and their logics, and how their dependence on the business models of social media platforms, the algorithms of social media platforms, are influencing their practices. And this is well explained within the broader context of the platformization of cultural production, that really a concept that really tells us how culture and the production of culture is changing from within due to the spread of digital platforms. And obviously, given that platforms are everywhere, platforms are so central and so ubiquitous, content creators' practices need to adapt to this environment. And in this sense, it is useful to keep in mind the idea of cross-platform labor. That is really a concept that highlights how content creators are in the need for being present on multiple platforms and capitalize on them differently, and having different streams of incomes, not to rely too much on some companies that are ultimately very fleeting to some extent, that are constantly changing, and we don't know where they will be in a couple of months or years. And I think that we kind of like had a clear example of that with the recent events with TikTok. So the fact that content production and content creation is so much dependent on digital platforms, and that labor is so much dependent not only on one platform, but on multiple ones, this obviously also increases the sense of precarity that content creators and content producers more broadly need to face. And so the nested precarities of social media content creators are another important piece of the puzzle to consider, to fully understand content creators' trajectories. And I really like this concept because it really gives us an idea of how different the layers of precarity, the dependence of platform, the dependence on the algorithm, the dependence on business models, are entangled and nested and cannot be considered as separate elements, but should be actually taken into account together. So this is the first set of concepts, and existing research has very much highlighted how to face this precarity and to face this platformization, being present with cross-platform labor is a key answer for content creators. But then what I started to see in my research is that there is another side of this coin that has to do with another kind of labor that content creators do in their activities, in their everyday lives. And here comes the second, let's say, set of concepts that it speaks more to my digital sociology kind of soul. And here I went back to Gill's work on, the neoliberal subjectivity more broadly, and specifically on the reflections that she was making together with Angela Merabi as well about second jobbing, right? So especially Gill was highlighting that within this contemporary neoliberal sensibility, people are pushed towards becoming the best versions of themselves. And she uses the idea of life being a pitch, right? Where professionals, but also people more broadly, are always and constantly pitching their next projects, pitching their next ideas in a way to improve themselves, empower themselves, and also be in line with the requirements of this fierce competition that neoliberalism enforces, and also a struggle with ourselves, right? To perform better, to always do more. And at the same time, this is a very isolated strategy to kind of approach again at the precarity of a labor market, not just a platform market, but of a labor market that is more and more unstable, more and more flexible, and more difficult to navigate. And so I was, with this article, I was trying to connect the idea of cross-platform labor and second jobbing to the careers of content creators. Also keeping in mind that this idea, more than a concept, that is the slash generation, that comes from a journalistic piece. And I really felt that it's an expression that describes very well what a lot of professionals are undergoing, included content creators. And so by combining these two, I came up with the idea of the composite careers, and we can define them as occupational trajectories that are characterized by diverse types of activities, but also roles, but also job titles across multiple fields and sectors. And with my research, I was able to find that most of the content creators actually use these composite careers and develop these composite careers throughout their lives to respond exactly to the challenges that being a content creator actually entails, beyond the superficial idea of just taking a picture for the cloud. And so I would like to go now a little bit more in depth with what are these composite careers, what they look like. And to do that, I'm going to present the three types of content creators that I also outline in the books. And there's types of creators, and therefore these different trajectories that they have created over time arise from some qualitative interviews that I undertook with content creators, mostly based in Italy. And at the time of the interviews, it was immediately after 2020. they were still mostly focusing on Instagram and maybe YouTube and exploring TikTok. So the kind of material that you will see now is mostly referred to the Instagram platform. So let's start with the easiest one, the more obvious one, the full-time content creator. In this kind of trajectory, it was possible to find creators that were fully involved in this activity, and that they decided to take a sort of a leap of faith and dedicate their full time just to the activity of creating content, and they were able to actually make a living out of this activity only. And I think it's interesting because my interviews did use the expression of, a leap of faith. But what emerges going more in depth in the trajectories of these creators is that, yes, there was a dimension of risk, but the full-time content creators built their careers on some visibility, on some capital that is already existing and that has already been established. And so here in the interview quote, Sophia mentioned that she already started a little blog on the side just for fun, and then when it became one of the most popular, then she decided to turn her blog into her actual job. And this is very different from another type of content creators and another type of composite career that I called the multitasker. And in this case, we can really see the composition that I was talking about before, as expressed by Lorna, that she highlights very clearly that she doesn't consider herself an influencer. She considers herself a photographer. And nevertheless, she highlights that being on Instagram for her and being engaged in promoting her or someone else's content, it's part of her job anyways. So in this category of creators, we see professionals that combine multiple activities and that in a way are freelancers in their creative industries and are also content creators on a side. And maybe they have other projects going on, exactly as the second jobbing or multi-jobbing idea recalls. And it's also interesting in this category how the trajectories, so their working trajectories, intersect with their identities and the perceptions of content creators' identities. Because this is just an example of some tensions that I really found amongst the content creators I interviewed between being content creators and being someone else, and having to negotiate these different identities according to the situations and the hats that one would have to put on while going through their everyday lives or their working activities. The last type of content creator and of trajectory that I found is what I called the passionate second shifter. And in this category, we find those people that are, let's say, close to the aspirational laborers described by Brooke Duffy. And these are the creators who do the job just for fun. And we can we can see here what Manuel states: Instagram's just a hobby for me. And what I found interesting is in this category is that the composition is related to creating content, being a content creator, and maybe studying, maybe working towards building a more stable job in another sector that is not related to the creative industries, or really having a more stable job that is the main job, and then doing the content creators just for fun and as a sort of extra income that can be accumulated by these creators. And so this made me thinking. I was really, by looking again at the picture that I put at the beginning, I was also thinking, in light of the changes that we are seeing now, what could we say about these trajectories, and how would they further change with the new challenges that social media platforms are posing in terms of governance, visibility, moderation, governance of platforms by other regulators. So what futures? And then another question that is really important to me, and for whom is this future? Because one of the things that I've always been interested in, but I've never researched deeply, is, can content creators' trajectories end at some point? What we are seeing online now are those who succeeded somehow at this job, right? But what about those who didn't? Where did they go? What happened to them? And I think this would be an important point to keep in mind when we talk about content creator and creator cultures. So yeah, this is it for me, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so very much, and yeah, for the concepts that you've introduced to us, that I think could be very valuable around the composite career and this idea of mapping trajectories. I'm really excited for us to get to talk about this further. But before I invite Tom to offer some thoughts in response, I would like to introduce Claire, who is our next presenter. So Claire Marzo is an associate professor at Paris East University in France, and she will introduce for us her chapter entitled Influences, Labour Law and Social Protection, a comparative analysis between France and the United Kingdom. So the floor is yours, Claire.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay, good. So yes, first of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for this invitation today, but also for allowing me to participate to this publication. I'm going to turn to a subject which is rather different. I mean, obviously, we're still talking about content creators, but I'll jump to the legal perspective, and I'm going to propose to assess the social protection of influencers, and I propose a comparative analysis between France and the UK. First of all, like the previous speaker, I'm going to explain where I come from. And in fact, the reason why I accepted to do this contribution is because I just finished a project on platforms, digital platforms. And here I must say that when I use the word platform, I don't use it at all in the same way as Lucia. And here I worked on digital platforms and social protection of workers. So the typical example would be Uber or Deliveroo. And because I had worked on their social protection and the legal perspectives, focusing specifically on platform workers' social protection and the use of social citizenship, I felt that it would be interesting to turn also to content creators and ask the same questions. And so that's what I did. So just to mention the website if you're interested. And so what I proposed to do was to propose a comparative section and to look at two jurisdictions, France and the UK, in order to think about the application of the law and the case law, and to answer the following questions. So are content content creators workers? What is their employment status? What legal protections and rights do they get? And particularly in terms of social protection. So that's what I did in the chapter, and I'm just briefly going into what I presented in there. So in order to propose a legal qualification, what I did was to go back to the definitions, to the practical understanding of what the job is, and after that, try to apply the laws as they exist in France and in the UK in order to draw some conclusions. And that's what I'm going to do right now, rather quickly, I promise. So when it comes to the definitions, I think I can go very quickly because probably you mentioned it already this morning. I mean, for us lawyers, it's important to go back to the definition because it gives us a scope of application and it helps us decide whether the law is going to be applicable or not, and obviously which law. So already when we compare the definitions in France and in the UK, we find that there are some differences, there is some vagueness, which is going to make it difficult to try and decide who an influencer is and what status he or she is going to have. I'm going rather quickly, but obviously I'll be happy to go into more details if people ask. Having seen the definitions, we can then turn to the different profiles. And here I think it's important to insist on the fact, probably something you had worked on in the first book as well, but we can insist on the fact that there is monetization and the different types of remuneration. So here I've made a little list of the different possible profiles, and I want to insist on the fact that many influencers do not earn a living. So like we focus on those who make millions, and obviously it's quite fascinating, but actually it is a whole different set of people, and not so many make that much money. Then we can distinguish between different categories. Some had already been identified by the publishers of the book, by the editors of the book, sorry, and I thank them for that. So I've copied that here. The affiliate marketing, the exchange of goods and services, or the endorsement deals had been identified. They had added as well the possibility of complex commercial transactions, which I was not so keen on because in terms of legal qualification was not so useful, because what we're going to try and see here is who is paying whom and where is the contract. So I think we can always go back to this, even if it is a little bit complex. I've added two other categories because I felt it was important, again, in terms of legal qualification. It's the AdSense program on the one hand and the crowdfunding type platforms such as Patreon. These platforms which sort of excludes a possible commander or someone who would give orders when it comes to creating contents in order to advertise for a given product, and I felt that it was worth mentioning it because here it will have an impact on the parties, on the number of parties, and on the contract again. Which takes me next to my to the next point, which is contracts, because as lawyers, we're trying to assess where is the legal relationship and what is going to create a possible status. So here, the first thing we need to say, and I think it's worth mentioning again, is that first, it used to be that it would be an oral contract, or should I say a virtual contract, because it would be a direct message, maybe some WhatsApp or whatever, which would then create an exchange between a content creator and someone who gives the order, who wants the advertising. And this would be enough to get started for an influencer relationship. Things have evolved with time, and now we tend to see many more contracts, even sometimes rather complex contracts which can be compared to existing contracts of editing, of advertising, etc. Very rarely do we find a contract of employment, but it does exist, so it should be mentioned as well. And we now find that there can be special clauses in the contracts, and there is a whole system of in order to help influencers and content creators creating those contracts, whether online or not. And so it has become much more solid, should I say. So what is it going to mean in terms of social protection? Here I've distinguished between France and the UK because we're going to see that we have two different systems. And here it becomes a little bit more specific, and so that's why I felt the need to make this distinction. When it comes to France, and this will be true in the UK, the first thing I'll say is that all income generated by an influencer's activity, whether on a primary or secondary basis, is subject to tax, contributions, and social security contributions from the first euro or pound, which means that there is no getting away with taxes, with social contributions, which also means, to see the positive side, that there is a participation to social protection, which means the discovering of rights when it comes to benefiting from social protection. So the big question we're asking, again, whether it is in France or in the UK, is the person an employee or a self-employed person? We have a specific status in France, which is called auto-entrepreneur, which is a self-employed person, but which is a status which is a bit facilitated and where you pay a bit less taxes. Even if there were debates very recently about that, it has not happened that the fees have been raised, so it remains an advantageous status. Having said that, most content creators are self-employed, and will distinguish between three possible categories, which have terrible names. I'm sorry about that. I've put them there. I'm not going to read them because there is no point. I've put them there both in French and in English, so you can see it and find it if you're looking for it. What's interesting for us is that as soon as you can identify that you belong to one of these categories, it will affect you to a given social security system. And so we'll distinguish between the three usual social security systems. The main one is the employees' social security system. Then we have a special one, which is for independent workers, which is called URSSAF SSI. And that is what you would get if you fall into the first category. So here what matters really is that your aim would be to promote goods or services in return for an economic benefit or a benefit in kind. And if so, you fall into this social security system. If you do not do that, if your purpose is not to promote goods or services in return for an economic benefit or a benefit in kind, then you fall into the second category. But still, you will fall into the URSSAF system. And interestingly, we're going to distinguish for the artistic activities, which can be sometimes very difficult to identify. So it is a little bit surprising, but then you will fall into a specific social security system, which is for artists and authors, and which is a little bit different, which is a bit more favorable. In fact, what I should say here is that those artists and authors have a social security which is a bit more advantageous, a bit more similar to the employees ones, and a bit more different to the independent ones. In the UK now, let me just go back to it. Yes, in the UK, so here again, same question. We're going to ask ourselves whether we have an employee, a self-employed person, or there is a third category in the UK, which is called a worker. This word is a little bit tricky because obviously a worker is someone who works, but it's also a specific status which is to be distinguished from the two of us, even if actually it's not completely distinguished, but it is a different status. I won't explain more unless you ask me. What's to be remembered is that here again, most of the time content creators are going to be self-employed persons. The question we can ask here is whether maybe we could have a requalification. Maybe the court could consider that a self-employed person is actually a worker. It is not a crazy question because this is something which happened in the Uber case, so not in the field of influence, but in the field of platform work and more specifically transport platform work with these Uber taxis. Anyway, in terms of consequences, what does it mean that we have self-employed workers? It means that they will have fewer employment protections than an employee. No protection against dismissal, no right to rest, no right to paid holidays or to a minimum wage. Collective agreements do not apply. Rights negotiated by a works council do not apply as well, logically, and the rights of association and collective bargaining are not very much used by workers because they are mostly more isolated. I'll turn to conclusions and I will finish there if my computer accepts. Yes. What I will say to finish is that there are very fast transformations. Not only are the systems and the contracts changing quickly, but the laws are changing quickly. And my chapter is already not exactly up to date, and I'm sorry about that. But that's how it is. When it comes to influencers, we see that they face problems of income irregularities and the lack of employment protections. And I'll finish with this insight, which is pretty much the same as what I just said, but pushing it just a little bit further and maybe bringing it back to the previous presentation. The idea would be that while platforms are gaining value from influencers' creative efforts and are aware of the value of influence to their business model, they are not rewarding influencers appropriately and consistently for their work. And I will finish with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much. I see that we have hands perhaps being raised with thoughts. Before we get to them, I would love to invite our two discussants to share some reflections and provocations based on the chapter. So I'll introduce them both now, and then if you want to follow each other, that would be wonderful. So first we will hear from Tom Devon, who is a PhD student at the Department of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is an ethnographer of user platform interactions focused on creator culture, platform affordances, and user-generated content. And then we'll hear from Hatcha Bosek, who's a PhD candidate at Utrecht University School of Governance, studying the regulation of digital labour platforms and platform work in Europe. So, over to both of you.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, super excited to be here, and thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with Lucia's beautiful chapter. And I already saw also on the chat that like there are many questions and stuff that we can engage. So I will react and reflect on like 2 points that I was very intrigued while reading the chapter. The first is actually something about accessibility, because I think that Lucia is this kind of chapter you can finally send to your people to read. And as I was like going through and really engaging deeply with the chapter, I kept sending bits of the chapter to my partner. And at one point, he asked me, why am I actually understanding what I'm reading? Because he's so used to me trying to introduce him with academic work, only for him to push back, and very rightfully saying that if you want people to read, write for them, not for your academic ego. And I think that's exactly what Lucia is doing. Her writing is so clear, engaging, and free from the usual gatekeeping that we so often isolate academic work from the people it actually concerns. And in that sense, that was like so beautiful to actually read and allow other people that are not academic to understand what we're speaking about. So only for that, it's an achievement. And even more importantly about accessibility, I think that Lucia's chapter is one of you can send to your very creators that you're studying. And this is quite rare. I think that this typology of full-time creators, multitaskers, and passionate second shifters provides a relatable, grounded framework, and not just for us as researchers to reassess and categorize creators differently, but even more so for creators themselves to see their own struggles reflected in a language that really speaks to their experiences. So Lucia allows us to see them and them to see themselves, but not as individuals navigating isolated survival strategies, but as laborers entangled within larger structures of precarity, neoliberal demands, and the constant negotiation of online and offline existence. And this is super powerful. And I think this reframes what often feels like personal adaptation into a systemic condition, making visible the pressures that shapes their careers, choices, and futures in ways that creators themselves may not have fully articulated before. And so this kind of like access that Lucia allows for creators to understand their life and their experiences, I will be happy to use a very powerful sentence on page 35, where Lucia articulates in saying, precarity can materialize at different levels, involving market dynamics, industry trends, and platforms, architectures, and algorithms. What distinguishes those precarities is their interconnection, urging us not to view those elements in isolation, but rather as deeply intertwined. And for me, that was very powerful to get this kind of like broader picture about the experiences of creators, and with Lucia imbuing those experiences with so much of the infrastructural precarity that those creators are experiencing. So that is kind of like my main point of reflection for us to discuss more. And my second point is about the concept, this idea of composite careers. And when I read Lucia's definition of that, I couldn't really help thinking about how this term encapsulates kind of like a paradox that at the heart of contemporary labor, which is the illusion of adaptability as empowerment. And I think that the word that you're choosing here, which is this kind of like this, the composite is kind of like this concept that you're proposing, suggests something that is carefully assembled, that is strategically layered, a fusion of multiple elements into one kind of like a coherent whole. But what you are actually revealing is that composite careers are not carefully built. They are continuously patched together and always on the verge of unraveling. And this is something very strong because it kind of like breaks this illusion of them enabling themselves like a successful career and on the top of their game. And I believe that your chapter forces us to ask, are composite careers a sign of professional resourcefulness or a symptom of forced survival? And you offer a framework that challenges the traditional notion of a career as a linear, stable, or singular, showing instead that in platform economies, multiple roles and jobs are not a choice, but a necessity. But also this necessity does not eliminate the complete agency, as you are not romanticizing creators as those hyper-adaptable entrepreneurs, nor does reduce them to helpless victims of platforms' instability. Instead, I felt like there is this lingering question above your text, asking what parts of this framework are real choices and what parts are merely conditions of survival. And I feel that this reality is best captured by the creator whose voices Lucia amplifies, like Lorena, that you also mentioned, because I think it's such a powerful interview. And she is a photographer, and she was reluctantly expressing her ambivalence towards the influencer economy and saying, I'm not into considering myself an influencer or even a content creator. I mean, I'm a photographer. But sadly, if you want to work, you have to play by the market's rules. And I think Lorena's words encapsulate the tension between creative identity and platform dependency. And she doesn't want to be an influencer, yet she has no choice but to participate in the visibility economy to sustain her work. Or as Lucia calls it on page 31, the intricate nature of content creators' work biographies, which diverge significantly from the traditional notion of career and the expectation of linear development and progression of hierarchy. And this really highlights the core issue Lucia identifies, that composites' career are not always about aspiration or strategy, but about survival in a system that refuses to offer stability. And it is through Lorena's reluctant engagement with Instagram promotional economy that Lucia forces us to rethink what it actually means to have a composite career. Is it really career flexibility, or is it simply precarity masked by autonomy? Composite career are not just about diversification, but about the unavoidable entanglement of labor, visibility, and platform control. A structure that creators must navigate rather than fully, truly shape. And I think this is the core and powerful argument that Lucia brings with her chapter, and I am full of appreciation for that. And thank you for the opportunity to engage with your chapter.
Am I up then? Shall I? Oh, perfect. Well, thanks for that. It was two really interesting presentations and also a very interesting first point of discussion from Tom. So thank you, everyone, for your contributions so far. I'm obviously talking a bit about the second chapter, which is focusing on influences, labour regulation and social security and so on in the UK and in France. And thanks for writing this, Claire. It was a really interesting comparative perspective. And as someone who also was doing comparative research into platform worker regulation, looking at France and the Netherlands mainly, I know how much of a challenge it can be when the systems of kind of regulation and the categories are so different across countries. To try and kind of figure out how to put them together into one thing is not the easiest thing to sort. And so it's really interesting to me personally to see how you can kind of draw the moments of distinction and similarity between the two of them. And I also enjoyed, and this I think goes to the whole book and both presentations today, the taking seriously of influencers as workers. And I think as someone who also does a lot of obviously field work in this area, looking at the regulation of platform work, there's still a long way to go before the specific kind of challenges and also the infrastructures of influencer work are, I think, fully understood. To give a little anecdote about this, I was doing an interview with inspectors at the Dutch Labour Authority, so labour inspectors, And we were talking about platform work and mostly focusing on Uber, Tausbesorgt, and things like that. And then I asked a question about influencers, and they said, "Why did you bring that up?" I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but they said, "Well, that's a whole separate thing that's got nothing to do with platforms." And I think it's interesting to always see how different connections are made, but also how connections aren't made. And I think that's that's perhaps the biggest thing I got from reading this chapter was an understanding of the different ways in which both we as social scientists and also regulators and officials seek to kind of classify and organize influencer work um, and also kind of platform work more broadly. For example, with the French tax code, where there were different, for example, tax rates based on whether they were doing artistic work as an influencer or not. And I think as someone who studies regulation, this is and the regulation of kind of the intersection of technology and work. What's interesting about these frameworks is that a lot of the time, and in this case too, a very digital phenomenon is organized and kind of ordered within regulatory systems based on its non-digital components. And so it's based on what what the influencers are doing, kind of independent of the technology. And this is something that we see a lot of the time. In my research in France, at the moment at least, I'm not looking at influences, although I might have to now. You've sparked my interest. Um, but the French government has actually made a new regulatory agency for regulating platform workers. However, they've limited it to rideshare and delivery services, and they've said, well, this for us is the platform economy, and so I think in some ways you really see the limitations and the challenges, I think, because one of the I think innovative things, and it's a bit questionable, this other model, and I don't want to go, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but it says, well, we want to keep them as self-employed and we won't make them employees, but we'll try and give them more social protection anyway. And so they organize elections for representatives and social dialogue sessions with the representatives of the platforms themselves, and they come up with kind of minimum wage guarantees and so on that apply to all rideshare and delivery platform workers in France. And I think there's still a lot of questions, I think, about whether this model works, and it's very controversial amongst the unions, for example. But as I was reading, as I was reading both chapters, which reflected a lot, I think, the diversity of identities and the type of working arrangements of influencers, whether that be the amount of time they dedicate to it, or whether they work for one or multiple platforms, the sources of income, and so on. And I think also that's one thing the chapter does very well, is to kind of highlight the differences here. Surely there's these kind of underlying questions of the regulation of technology informed work that can be addressed regardless of what influencers look like, by regulating the platforms themselves in a kind of a new workplace context. And it's something we see across the board, I think. For example, I'm working on a study at the moment looking at a comparative, or not a comparative, but a cross-agency scope of the entire Dutch regulatory estate. And a lot of them focus on, even though they're very knowledgeable about platforms technologically, they regulate platforms in healthcare or in the taxi sector and so on. And so I think in all of these kind of cases, we can see the effects of technology being regulated, but not necessarily the technology itself. And so I think there's interesting questions that come from this chapter about actually there's so many of these different ways we can see influences as work and working arrangements. And I think that's very important from a labor perspective, a labor law perspective. But I wonder if there's some kind of better model or different model focusing on the platform power and the way that these influencer platforms, social media platforms, should I say, kind of shape and influence, ironically, influence what being an influencer looks like, regardless of the type of the work itself. So thank you for the wonderful chapter. And thank you as well, Lucia, for your chapter. That was really interesting. And I'm looking forward to actually reading more of the chapters after this.
Thank you so very much to both Acha and Tom for the very thoughtful remarks, and also posing more things for us to consider, particularly around how we perceive the work of influencers and how that might affect things like their legal classification, as well as the way we think about them as workers. I guess I'm mindful of time, so we might have to wrap up very shortly, but I wanted to provide space for anyone who can still stay on for a few minutes, for whether Lucia or Claire wanted to offer any final reflections before we head off.
Yes, thank you very much. Lucia, is it okay if I go first? Because I'm going to go in a few minutes. Thank you so much, Archer, for your comments. You're raising a very good question. Having worked on both platform workers and Uber and influencers, it's very true that you cannot help but ask the question that was asked at the very beginning of this webinar: how does the law fit? And it's true that you're really tempted to kind of put it all in the bin and think about it again. I mean, it's very radical, obviously, but the point is that you're absolutely right to mention that in France, we have this specific law, which I did not mention in the chapter, and this specific body, the ARP, which is in charge of transport platform work, and I mean, transport platforms. And it seems very unfair and very surprising that those workers are going to get specific rights. And actually, when it comes to social protection, they don't get anything different from independent workers. But you turn to other platforms, like cleaners, designers, whatever, or content creators, and suddenly there is nothing there. So, we always say that there is no gap in the law. Like, we always find a way. The law will always have to apply, so that, so we need to find a way to make it work. But you really are tempted to say, like, how can we think it so that there is some fairness here between the different types of work, between the different statuses? The point, really, and as workers and as lawyers working on work, we want to achieve protection of those workers. And it's really the first question which has to be put forward. So thank you so much. I'm really sorry I need to leave already, and I won't have had the time to discuss with you all. But I was very pleased to be with you today, and I'd be very happy to continue the conversation. Thanks.
And shall I say something quickly? I mean, I'm not gonna take much of your time. I just wanted to thank you all for engaging with our chapters, and to really everyone, and especially to Tom for the very kind words. Really, I appreciate that. And I was just while listening to Claire's presentation, I couldn't help but thinking like how it resonated with me, especially while at the beginning of the chapter. I really reflect on the definition of what is a profession from a sociological perspective, right? So I think that despite the differences in the approaches, there are some similarities also in this idea of finding similarities and finding differences and providing some references for content creators themselves. And so yeah, I think what Tom was saying about this idea of resourcefulness and survival coming together. I think that this is truly what I witnessed in those interviews, and really what I think would be crucial moving forward with all the challenges that are, awaiting for us as researchers and content creators themselves and regulators and everyone around the digital economies, broadly speaking.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, I'm sure we could continue discussing this for a lot longer, but I think at this point we perhaps may have to say farewell. But thank you all so much for being here, and for people who joined a bit later, as Catalina mentioned, we will make sure to distribute the recording, and then we have one final webinar next week where we will be reflecting on some of these issues again. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.